Today is February 28th. Oki, Naganago, Mekoche Chestakomaki. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. Native Calgarian is being recorded on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed U.S.-Canadian border are the Blackfeet. North of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, and Bagani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley Chiniki Bearspaw Nations of the Stoney Nakoda, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit, status, and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with government signing on your behalf. I honor the Blackfoot elders and members. They've been so kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot Mokinstus, as Michelle Elliott, an English name which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene, or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellow Knives Dene. My father is so Canadian, I'm a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution, while having an Indian Act imposed status card. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Hare people, also called the Great Bear Lake people in Treaty 11. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene nation is a visitor to this area of Pincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning many horse town, named after the Calgary Stampede. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as a guest and acknowledging your role, my role, as a treaty partner. My humblest apologies to Blackfoot elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. Any mistakes or misinterpretations will be on me. I encourage questions so that misunderstandings can be cleared up as soon as possible. I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous, but I share what I know as I walk down my red road. Because apparently my issues, life, and content are triggering. If you're experiencing emotional distress after anything we talk about today and want to talk, call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 1-855-242-3310. It is toll-free, open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can also text at hopeforwellness.ca. For more related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, for immediate emotional assistance, you can call 1-844-413-6649. This is a national toll-free 24/7 crisis line providing support to anyone who requires emotional assistance relating to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit. Non-Indigenous, there are distress center lines in your area and many a functioning 211, or you can also call 1-833-456-4566. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to my previous donors for already showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those that cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. I also have a YouTube channel where you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcast and pin posts on social media. So I'm really excited to have two guests today. So Larry, maybe we'll start with you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Proud to be here. And for those who don't know, Michelle and I have been longtime friends and colleagues, and Laura and I as well have been longtime friends and colleagues. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Speaking of lineage, we'll get right into it. My father used to say the line, "I'm part Scotch, part water." His mother was from Scotland and his father was from Barbados. And if you trace back our line in Barbados, it goes back to at least 1710.
Oh, wow.
But my name Leach is English, so at some point the family would have been in England. And the original Leaches were pharmacists. Were at the time they didn't really have doctors, so they were known as doctors. But and literally they used leeches to suck poison out of people. So that was the original pharmacist / doctor. And so in typical fashion, you were named after your profession, baker,
wow.
et cetera, et cetera. So that's the lineage of the name. And you'll see several spellings of it. And a lot of it depends on what part of the UK you're from. So I believe Leitch is the Scottish version, Leech is the Irish, and Leach is English. But My grandmother from Scotland, her last name was Connor, and Connor is an Irish name.
Mm.
So at some point, her family was in Ireland. And then we get to my mother's side. She was born in Liverpool. And I'll just point out I'm wearing a Liverpool shirt because we play today, and I'm a Liverpool supporter by blood, because my mom is from there, and my grandfather used to go to the Cop and watch games there. But her family name Jennings is also Irish, so
Oh,
both sides' roots go to Ireland. And Fast forward, we did a trip to Ireland 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years ago now, and I did a tour in front of the Irish Bank of Ireland, which used to be the Parliament of Ireland.
oh,
And a interesting quote came out, which I then immediately thought of the Calgary Board of Education. And Laura will get a kick out of this. I'm sure I've told her this one before, but Jonathan Swift at the time was, you might know him from Gulliver's Travels, but he was actually a political commentator. And Gulliver's Travels is actually very, very politically driven. And back in the day, the Irish Parliament was ready to vote themselves out of existence and basically give themselves to the UK. And at the time, they were very, very much part of the UK and didn't have a lot of power anyway. And Jonathan Swift wrote of the Irish Parliament, they have very little power and desire far less. And I immediately thought of the Calgary Board of Education because at the time I think I was just after my trustee run, and I was still heavily involved in discussing issues around that. And so it's interesting how in my lineage, in my backstory, there's a time where here's a whole country who literally, have very little power and desired far less. And here I was living in it. And still today, I think a lot of times the Calgary Board of Education often sort of gives themselves up to the provincial government and stuff. And we'll get into that, obviously. What I'm doing now, I'm proud executive director of 12 Community Safety Initiative, past president of Crossroads Community Association, board chair at Cornerstone Youth Center. And a lot of my worlds intersect, which is really, really fun when that happens. And today is another one of those great intersections, and I look forward to the conversation. Hope
right.
that introduction is good enough to start.
That's a great intro. I love it. Laura, this is actually our first time meeting, and I'm super stoked to
Yes.
have a conversation with you. So, I'd love for you to introduce yourself too.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here too. It's been great to reconnect with Larry. We haven't talked forever, except on sort of trading tweets. So nice to see his friendly face. Um, so my name is Laura Schudiak. I have sort of been a long time born and raised Calgarian. My backstory is interesting too, as everybody's really are when you start talking about them. My dad's side of the family is a Ukrainian immigrants from the first part of the 1900s. My mom's side of the family is French Canadian, and she actually grew up speaking French. Um, my mom's father was an Indian agent, which is an interesting. Um, it's forced me to look at a lot of the things that I've learned in a different lens, given especially the Truth and Reconciliation Report. Um, I've been involved in school board politics. I've been involved in politics for a long time volunteer on a whole range of things. My current project right now is I'm trying to get a grant for a bike to school project, and I'm really excited about it. And yeah, it's great. And I should acknowledge that we ride, because that's what we do when we bike to school, on the traditional territories of Treaty 7. And I found your acknowledgement very interesting, and I always learn when I hear them. So thank you for sharing.
Oh, I have to share this. The other day, I had a meeting, and it was national, and we had a black person from Toronto, and hers was out of the park because she talked about her lineage being, forced relocation, slavery, violence, and I was like, holy, this is best land acknowledgement I've ever heard. So it is incredible. Like it's one of my favorite things that's been happening since I guess the TRC. And one other thing, Laura, you have a kitty, and I've seen a black dog come in. And I think that Zoom protocol is that we need to know your cat's name and your dog's name.
Okay, well, Juno is the dog. There are three cats that may not come into the picture. The one here who sleeps on the dog's bed, that's Summit. So
These are some of my favorite parts about Zoom meetings, I tell you. The fatigue's not the much fun, that's for sure, though. So what really brought us all together was this name change to Langevin. Now, Larry was literally the first person to bring this to my attention. So, Larry, why don't we talk about the first time we talked about Langevin in general, and then that bigger conversation about the bridge, and then the school.
All right, I'll get into that. But before we start about that, I just wanted to share some learnings I had around land acknowledgements, because I too attended a national webinar. And you and I have talked about land acknowledgements for many, many years, but I still didn't know there were land acknowledgements that started with, I am in the unceded territory of the Algonquin.
Yeah.
And many BC tribes as well, unceded territory. So that was new to me. And so I just wanted to share that learning because I thought this would be appropriate place to share that learning.
Oh, it is. And the truth is that the numbered treaties, which is like the majority of Canada, it's all unceded territory too, because the agreement was to live equally, and that's never been properly acknowledged. And it wasn't a land agreement in the sense that, oh, here's our land, so it technically there's nothing that is, so-called ceded in Canada. And I always say that even the treaties were signed under duress. But I always encourage people from our area to go to the Blackfoot Crossing and to hear it straight from the Blackfoot, and and the elders from the Stony and the Dene. Hal Eagletail, he has a way of to tell the story as well, and so every nation has their way to talk about these treaties, and none of them will probably say it was ceded. But have you guys seen Jeremy Solis's latest tweets about Sutina in Calgary? I'll just plug it. Yeah, I'll just plug it. Check out his newest tweets. So, but let's get back to Langevin. So,
I will.
Yeah, go ahead, Larry. Great convo.
Yeah, over 7 years ago, I guess it's been now. It might even be as much as 8. My son was a grade 7 student at Langevin School. Today, he's a 20-year-old visual effects artist in Vancouver. And he, frankly, he's still quite embarrassed that the name hasn't changed. So he's known for that amount of time too. And the only reason I really found out about how the school was named was because Rory was doing a project on the Langevin Bridge. And I Googled it and looked up the Wikipedia page, and I saw in quotes, known as the architect of the residential school system, or Indian residential school system. And I just, my jaw hit the floor, and I didn't even know how to talk to my son about it. Like, this is his school and he's going to be there for the next 3 years. And so, I started talking to trustees. I started talking to people that were running for trustee. I started talking to the principal, teachers, etc. Because we had just been to the Glenbow Museum not a week before that. And a lovely young lady took us through the whole piece in there on the residential school systems. And she was, I believe, a daughter and a granddaughter of somebody who went through the residential school system. So it was very emotional, very, very emotional. And so to have that knowledge come on the back of that experience was just something that I didn't even know where to start the conversation with him. But we move on. And so I ran for trustee. Laura ran for trustee before me. We know most of the people at the table today. We knew a lot of the people from previous boards. And there were points where I thought, okay, I've said my piece, and I kind of trust them to do the right thing. And I truly believe that of the 6 people there, and the ones I know really well, have no interest in keeping the name there. I don't think it's a fight of having to convince them the name needs to come off, more that it is about the how and the process, and really kind of hiding behind the systematic piece. And somebody somewhere has convinced them that that's more important than really a simple symbolic gesture that would mean so much to so many people, of just taking the name off. You don't have to rename it. You just simply take the name off and run with a, Edmonton Eskimos to Edmonton Football Club type of scenario, or Washington, or what have you.
Yes.
So I'm kind of at the point 7+ years in where I'm fed up, right? I've had the conversations. You and I have talked a ton about it, Michelle, and it's just time to get done. You know, we've changed the name. We've said this a million times, but I'll say it for your listeners. We've changed the name of a bridge. We've changed the name of Langevin Block, but the very thing that this man is known for about schools is still on his name, is still on a school. And that to me is very embarrassing as a Canadian. And if we could just get that one piece of, as I've put it, low-lying political fruit um, changed. There's nobody in Calgary that has any connection to Langevin. There's nobody in Calgary that has any personal, uh, affiliation with him. The only reason that the school is named for him is because he got money as public works minister for the original bridge, not the current bridge, the original bridge. And then they just kept the name on the new bridge when they replaced it. And then the school ended up getting named after the bridge because it's close to the bridge. It's really that simple. There was no great honor that this great man had done great things for Calgary. It might be a different argument if that was the case. There might be some folks that really would be upset by the name change. But really, there's no Calgary reason to keep that name there whatsoever. There's very little argument other than that we just don't want our symbols changed, and we're rewriting history, and that silly argument. But I'll stop there, and maybe let Laura talk a little bit more about it, and maybe we can get into sort of the why and the way that the school board kind of is set up for failure in a lot of cases.
No kidding.
Yeah, well, Larry, what you talk about low hanging fruit. I mean, that's very, very obvious. And I think the fact that the renaming of the bridge happened very quickly and without really any blowback that I recall. I mean, it wasn't like there was, it was just seen as the right thing to do. And I, like I said, I don't. I mean, that's what, 3.5 years ago now. I don't, I don't recall sort of any big opposition to the name change. Again, this is a no brainer. I think I actually see this potentially as being um, what the current 6 trustees have done over the last um, sort of 2 months. I mean, I was pleased to see them allow the students talk at their last board meeting, because they made an exception because there wasn't anything regarding the school or Indigenous learning on the agenda, and they allowed them to speak. I actually, when I was watching the emails go around and saw that this was planned, I was thinking, oh no, they're going to get turned down and they're going to look really, really bad if they didn't allow these kids to speak. But they did the right thing and allowed them to speak. But then I think, um, you know, have said since, and that they just have no ability to do this at this time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to cause um, people across the province to say, why do we need school boards? They cannot do the basic, easy, low hanging fruit things that are quite obvious that need to be done. I mean, especially when you look at it in conjunction with that report on Indigenous learning, where they admit they are failing on every metric around Indigenous learning and Indigenous students not meeting the same standards as settler students. They cannot do this. So then the question, it really, really begs the question, why even have them? And I think that could potentially be the longer term conversation that we're having out of this failure to take down a name on a school.
Yeah, no kidding. I'm reminded now of Jennifer Pollock and Daniel Smith and Teresa Wupa long time ago when they weren't getting along on the school board, and Ralph Klein came in and just shut it down. And I've always thought since then, if you could do that and the system still works, really and truly, what do you need to this whole school board for? Like, really? So I think those are some really great valid points, Laura. I really appreciate you bringing them up. And so I guess just to give you some background on my connection here. Oh boy, where do I start? My daughter, I originally put her in a Lutheran school that was right around the corner from here. And it was actually fell in Rocky View because I'm on the far east of Calgary. So it was like there's like, a train that basically is the boundary there. So she went to the school and it was a wonderful experience. It was a small little school as opposed to Calgary Board of Education's big schools, but they're having land problems there. So I don't know what I was thinking in trying to help bring awareness and hopefully save the school, but it didn't work out. I tried to even bring Derek Wildebrandt in because I felt Leela Hare wasn't helping enough with that as well. So in the board, the Rocky View board was very clearly UCP leaning, except for one person, and she was just a godsend. Anyway, so we transferred my daughter to a French immersion program in the CBE, and that was a disaster. Um, it turned out that what they said that they could do and what they could do were two totally different things. I was disappointed because she came from a school that she was able to play sports, and then comes to a school where she didn't make the so-called cut. She has a flute, couldn't get into the band, and then she felt so disregarded and so many times. One point in time, the gym teacher marked her as absent, even though she was there. This was a constant issue with them. And then disregarding her, she kept hearing gay slurs in the hallways and such. She actually went on a CBC national conversation about bullying. And the next day, the teachers sat her down and bullied her by talking to her and basically saying, "You can come to us." She was a new kid. This was happening in front of the teachers. They weren't doing anything. And now they're bullying her. So there was no, there was a new Indigenous liaison that I fought for because I don't know if you know, they had Indigenous liaisons that weren't Indigenous. So like and that was totally acceptable to them. Totally acceptable racism. That was totally fine. So then now my daughter, she's not doing as well in school as she was. She doesn't like learning. She actually said a prayer and said, "I don't want to go to school anymore." And then the pandemic happened. So I'm like, I'm really sad it took a pandemic for your mother to really figure out you don't need to be there. I've talked to Larry. I ran for Ward 10, and homeschooling has always been on the table for me for reasons of bullying and other particular reasons. But then the Phoenix Foundation obviously is a homeschool kind of base, and so anyway, homeschooling matters to me. So we finally pulled her and we put her in a really low key homeschooling ring, which now I'm thinking I need to make like an Indigenous homeschool ring, but that's another conversation for another day. Um,
I
anyway,
support that. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
yeah, I hear you. Yeah, and I'm actually at the point where I'm done trying to work with these institutions that don't want to change. Because this particular one, the CBE, they do not want to change. And even that conversation that was on the school, on the Indigenous report, they didn't want to let me be at that meeting. I got a really curt email being like, "Oh, what could you possibly want to be on the agenda to talk for?" And I'm like, and I literally had signed, Satu Dene, all of these, like my address, everything. So they knew I was, you know, Indigenous before they even sent that curt email back to me. So anyway, finally get to speak to them. I actually spoke to, so Marilyn Dennis is the Ward 10 school trustee, and I talked to her about this during the election because I was running, she was running, we were in very similar circles. And her answer to me was so hurtful that I was like, oh, this woman is not my ally. And I tried to tell others she is not Indigenous friendly, but there was a belief that maybe. And then to hear them speak about the Indigenous report was so upsetting. I couldn't even believe they basically wrote off Indigenous students. Like people like my family are a total write off to them. They could care less. So that was really hurtful, really hurtful. And I had posted about it, and one of the school trustees actually engaged on it, and I couldn't believe the lack of understanding. To say they need anti racism training and Indigenous education is such an understatement. So I knew, I guess, 2 years ago, and met a teacher, and they had started a campaign. They sent 400 letters to the CBE, and they disregarded them to change the name of Langevin. So at that point, I knew as an Indigenous voice, they don't care about me. And I knew then, I knew from Maryland, I knew from that interaction, I knew it wasn't going to get done with an Indigenous leading it. So it was a godsend to have one of the parents reach out to me on Twitter and say, "Oh, our kids have been trying to, change this letter, but we don't want to speak for Indigenous people." So I'm like, "Let's have a committee, or let's have a meeting." So we had a Zoom meeting, and then we struck a committee, and then we brought in more people, and I started to bring in Indigenous letters of support, um, because I think folks with no Indigenous understanding and training, they're like, well, out of all of the issues that are of importance to Indigenous, I don't think this is the main one. And I'm like, you don't understand. My daughter wants to be a marine biologist. How on earth can I send my daughter to a Langevin school that's supposed to, if I were lucky enough to win the lotto? And I mean that literally for folks who are listening in who aren't from Calgary, that this science school is the only science school in Calgary, and it's a lotto system in order to get into it if you don't live right in that area. So I'm not actually joking when I say you need to win the lotto to get your kid in there. So even if we won the lotto, how do I send my daughter, who our family's been significantly impacted by Sacred Heart Indian Residential School in Fort Providence? How do I send my daughter to Langevin School and just overlook that racism? But that's the racism that we are expected as Indigenous people to overlook on a regular basis. And these organizations, they have no care in the world to actually change when it's in the best interest of the children. And that's not even including the whole conversation on the racism against Black students and all of the work that they've been doing over the last year to talk about racism and try to address it. It's really a disappointing conversation to have. But with these youth leading this conversation, I'm hoping we will move the conversation forward. And that's been really hopeful for me, is to see their voices, and then to actually have a good friend of mine be an alumni, and she's a part of Idle No More as well. And she struggled with addiction and talked about that issue of finding out later. And our Indigenous people are so devalued. And then, of course, we have intergenerational trauma and then complex trauma that happens in our lifetime that leads us to addiction. And thank God she's been, not just in recovery, but going to Bow Valley and, getting her addiction certification and such so that she can, help others who, as she has real life experience. So, it's been quite an adventure just talking about one school, one name, and I can't believe how much work we've had to do, and for it to be disregarded. It's been really that sucks. Not gonna lie, that sucks. So, Larry, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to touch base on the whole FMNI results that they continue to publish, and I'm sure Laura would agree. It probably even goes back to 2010 and further when she was running. But I remember vividly those conversations around those reports every year, and they really felt like tick boxes. They felt like they really weren't looking to solve the issue, and there is no improvement from probably 20, well, probably the beginning of time, but from when we've been looking at it from 2009 until today. And again, Laura and I have friends on there who are good people who I think genuinely want to make that change, but they seem to not be able to make any meaningful attempts. Um, we do understand that, moving the Titanic away from the iceberg, as I like to say quite often about the way the Calgary board operates, it's so big that to move it away from the iceberg, it can be a long process. But we're talking decades here, and there's been no needle movement on Indigenous education. And I remember Carol Bazinet, former trustee, asked this question at a meeting, and it really struck me. And I know I've shared it with you, Michelle. This is self-identified FMNI, which is First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So how many folks who are doing well in school who might not want to identify as Indigenous are there? So how even accurate is this number? And yet they parade it in front of us every year because it's a requirement of Alberta education. So that piece is troubling. And then again, it goes part and parcel with keeping the name Langevin there. But I was on another topic about planning and stuff on Twitter, and I posted because people couldn't understand why school boards weren't really involved in planning and community building, and I said, well, that's not their stated goal. It's about student learning. Period. End of. If they close a school and kill a community, that's not in any of their policies. Your real estate values for having a house across the street from a school is not in any of their policies. Their policy is directly about student learning. But they also serve two masters. Their first master is their policies, and their policies should reflect the general public, which over time I would argue that they do. And their other master is the Board of Education. And the Board of Education likes to have trustees and school boards there because they can deflect criticism. If something's going wrong, well, that's up to the school board. We like local authorities. And back to Laura's point about, do we even need school boards? That's the issue, is that they are pushed and pulled in so many different directions that they really have no ability to be effective in making any great systematic change. And I would even say the chief superintendent is hampered by that as well, because again, any kind of issue within education to the ministry gets deflected down to the school board. We have local authority. So even if you took away the board and you had an administrator administrate it, they'd still have the board here. They'd still have the chief superintendent, and they could deflect any kind of issue down to them. But maybe one person being in charge might help get the kind of systematic change that we might need. Maybe.
Right, and especially if he's a black man.
Right.
Laura, would you like to pipe in there?
Yeah. So Larry, lots of interesting points raised by both of you. I think one thing is clear about the idea of publicly elected, trustees, is that you can have people, good people who I believe truly want to do the right thing, get elected, and then over time you just see how they get chewed up and spit out by the system.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways, I, knock on wood 1,000 times that I did not get elected, because I think my mental health, my sense of purpose, my everything is a million times better, having not been elected.
It's interesting you should say that, because I feel the same way. Sometimes Like at first I was really hurt and disappointed, but it's that bigger picture. Like, could you really work with these toxic people? Anyway, please
Yeah.
continue.
Yeah, well, so I lost, and it was really bitter and ugly. I actually moved to Ontario for a couple of years just to escape the toxicity of it all.
Yeah.
But it was funny because I hadn't actually watched or listened to a board meeting until that discussion about Indigenous learning and their results. And the point Larry made, that their focus is supposed to be all about educational outcomes, I thought was really interesting, because they accepted, those trustees as a whole accepted, that it could be a generation or two before these results are fixed. And I'm like, in what world is that appropriate for a school board to just say, oh, we can do this in 30 years? I
That
was
was
just,
the
it just,
comment. That was the comment that hurt me so bad. I was like, you just wrote off my family, the next generation. So even my grandchildren are not safe in your goddamn schools. Even
yeah,
my grandchildren. I was
yeah.
so livid at that. And they were just like, no problem, just a stupid native. That's how it felt anyway, I should say. So,
Like I said, I was absolutely, my jaw dropped when I heard that, and then there was no pushback in debate from other trustees on that. I was floored. But I think your take on your own daughter's experience, um, again, shows the complete failing of school boards. There should not be such a different experience from one school to the next, especially around basics like bullying. Um, I can tell you, um, I've been school council chair. I have to count up the schools, 6 different schools, and my experience has been vastly different. Now, my experience is going to be very different than yours.
yeah.
I come at this from an absolute place of privilege, and so I obviously have some inherent, principles will listen to me because of that, um, and because of my sort of understanding of school board politics, which is helpful to them. But literally, in the same vein, I've had, my son was in grade 7 at a school, and I struggled with this principal on everything. He was not interested in engaging with parents in any way, shape, or form. And it's funny because that school, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, Harold Panabaker. Some of the schools on the southwest side of the city actually have a big concentration of Indigenous learners because of the proximity to Sutina.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to engage some of those Sutina parents because I knew them from the hockey team, um, and our boys had played together. But that principal was ignoring me that way. I was thinking, man, what's he doing to these racialized and Indigenous parents? Anyway, I pulled my son from that school, and was able to move him to another school. But again, that goes back to my privilege. I could move him to another school because I knew the principal at the other school. He knew me and was going to allow my son in as a out of boundary student. Not everybody would have that same experience because they didn't have the connections or understand the system the way I did. So, so I think that's a huge problem. I mean, and when I was having those issues, I was working through the process. Um, and it was, I mean, this was basic issues. They would have, um, I mean, basic things. A new principal in the school changes all the policies without any engagement of parents. So something as simple as the old principal used to open the doors at 7:30, and the students could come in and get dropped off and hang out in the hallway, or grab some breakfast from the snack shack, and hang out until classes started. The new principal locked the doors, did not want to supervise those kids. And and then that's a problem for parents, because if you are dropping your child off on the way to work, um, you need to be able to drop them off. You can't leave them sitting outside. And literally, I explained how they needed to engage. Anyway, he didn't care. He just locked the doors. And that's I was just floored. But again, taking that up the food chain, nobody really cared. Principals are so empowered. Nobody wanted to change that behavior. And so then again, you just go shopping for a different school, which is not what should happen across a broad school system. So when I think about if we got rid of school boards, what would things look like? Again, I think the opportunities that have come out of Bridgeland Science School show us that local communities, parent communities, and the communities that surround them can be the governance model that schools need. Wouldn't it be great if a school could determine, a school community could determine what makes sense for their school? What kinds of things do they want in a principal? Okay, we're hiring a new principal. The CBE is supposed to have a process where they go to parents and say, what qualities do you want in a principal? It happens, it's a complete hit and miss from my experience, whether that discussion even happens. So again, it depends on a whole range of things, and it shouldn't. This is talking one school system should not be hit and miss like this. Okay, and I'll leave it at that.
Oh no, it's great. I think it's really important to give that context. And Larry, I will let you finish any thoughts that you have, but I was also thinking that maybe people are not going to believe this, but there's like yet another level of governance in the CBE called areas as well. And I don't know if we're going to have enough time to get into it, but I'm just going to pop it into both of your heads to start thinking about it. But Larry, would you like to respond?
Well, there's a couple of things that Laura brings up. The whole closing of the schools in the morning. It is the exact reason why Cornerstone Youth Center has a breakfast program. We had students come to Cornerstone saying, yeah, we get dropped off at a certain time. My parents have to drop me off at a certain time because they have to go to work and we can't get into the school. And that precipitated us to start a breakfast program so that the kids at Sir John Franklin, which is our closest school, got a warm place to sort of gather their thoughts, have some breakfast, and as it turns out, disclose some pretty horrific personal stories in the morning. So, those are things that schools have prided themselves away from, and why I'm so passionate about being involved in Cornerstone, because now we are the place where kids in the community can gather, and whereas schools used to be that for a lot of people.
I was gonna. How could we have schools that aren't a safe harboring place for students to gather? Like, it's just let's just shut those doors.
Yeah. And we've literally said as a board, like, our pie in the sky goal, if we had millions of dollars dumped on us, would be to have a Cornerstone in every community that needs one. Well, the more you talk to parents and the more you see what goes on out there in schools, and the less that they are communities for kids, the more that every community needs one. So there's that bit.
Larry, they could just be, you could put a Cornerstone in the school building.
Right.
Like, you don't even need a separate space. It should be there.
It should be. Yeah, I agree 100%. But we're still trying to steer that Titanic past the iceberg. It's much easier for an external organization like Cornerstone to just set up shop and go. And we've had quite a lot of support from Sir John Franklin and their teachers and staff over the years, because it is easy for them to let somebody else do it rather than take the bold action to do something on their own, because they get slapped if it goes sideways. But getting to the point about local governance, Laura, and I don't know if you know more than I do around this, because I don't know a ton. But from what I understand, that is more the Edmonton public model, where more power is given to the local school than we do here in Calgary, right?
Yeah, I mean, part of that's a function of budgeting. So in Edmonton Public has what they call a decentralized budget. It's 100% decentralized. So a school will decide what percentage of, say, curriculum support they want to get from downtown. the school will decide, okay, we've identified these students that need counseling support or psychological support, or they need, speech therapists or whatever. So all of those centralized resources, speech therapy, counseling, curriculum development support, each school will put a budget number on that. And so those, I like to say, they're somewhat right sized by the people who actually know what kind of resources they need. Calgary does it the other way. They budget those things centralized, and then they ask teachers based on their estimates that they get from the schools. I mean, there is a connection there, but they're not budget line items in a school budget. They are centralized resources that are thought of in a centralized way. And so that's why, in my mind, we've never been able to get the number of centralized office staff down at the CBE, because they say, we're determining these resources and we see them being needed, but they don't have that sort of connection back to the school in as a firm and a direct way that Edmonton Public has. And I think that's causing some of the problems. This is head office deciding what all those schools need, as opposed to the schools deciding what they need and having head office provide them. So I think fundamentally that's part of the problem. And again, I think that, like I said, I'm still school council chair. I mean, it used to be when my oldest, who's now 22, was in kindergarten, I remember having school budgets put in front of our school council meetings and us having conversations about decentralized budgets, about how much the school was going to allocate to new library books or new computers or new whatever, because the detail was put to us, or the budget was put to us in that detail. I mean, the staff were lumped as a staff, but we did see, okay, there's money for a music teacher, there's money for a phys ed specialist, there's part-time money for a librarian. I have not seen that in that detail in probably 6 or 7 years for sure. And I think that is that was one of our Arctic's issues, right? Transparency around school budgets. And there was some improvement when we were talking about it. But then it's disappeared into the ozone. And then, like I said, then we have these, in my mind, much more important low-hanging fruit type of issues around sort of the name of the school or learning results that's where people are focusing. They're not as worried about the how the money's been spent at their school. But to me, we maybe need to look at we maybe need to pull that apart and look at the budget numbers, because everything goes back to numbers. And I think in most organizations, you would say that from Cornerstone, when you're on the board, your money, how you spend your money, should follow through on your priorities. And I think maybe it's time for someone. I mean, we used to be doing this, with Trina leading it, looking at those numbers and how they connected back to the outcomes that we were looking for. I'm thinking that those budget versus outcomes are being separated yet again, and there's not a connection to them.
I'm thinking too, Laura, maybe you could let the listeners know what Arctic's is, because I don't think we really touched on that.
Yeah, we didn't.
Yeah.
So after the 2010 election, I lost, current trustee Herdman lost, and there was a number of issues that we felt we could bring forward. The biggest one that was part of my campaign was the construction of the Edu Palace, as I call it, the headquarters downtown, that was done on a lease and with very little transparency. I had pulled a number out of financial statements that said the future costs of that lease were going to be $285 million, which was about 3 times the cost of what it should have been if you were building a building, and many times more than what should have been a rental rate for that. So that I want to say the building, the lack of transparency. So Arctics, we called ourselves the Association for Responsive Trusteeship in Calgary Schools. And we worked to shine a light on mostly the budget, but also their governance issues and structures. And I want to say the one thing that we won, or the one sort of big accomplishment we did, was they refused to spend the money on broadcasting their board meetings. So I don't know if you remember that meeting when we pulled in with a video camera, and we weren't able to live stream, but we recorded it to post later. And that was a pretty big sort of show that, you know what, it ain't that difficult. Make an effort towards transparency, and if you're not going to make an effort towards transparency, we're going to do it for you. And that changed behavior. Within, I want to say, we probably only recorded 4 or 5 meetings before they said, "Oh, we'll do this ourselves." So yeah, that was Arctics, and it was fun, and it's how Larry and I got to know each other. And yeah, so I set it up, and then I moved to Ontario and left Larry with it.
And you'll love this, Michelle, because we all have a mutual friend in Kent-Hare, and Laura and I met at Kent-Hare's Pints and Politics, which then got me involved in Arctics.
Oh, right. Really? That's great. Yeah. Well, and then Judy was on the board, and which is Kent's mother, and now Richard's on the board, which is Kent's father, and he's the one, and Judy was before then the one in the district of Langevin. So we've even had friends in the position to do this. And another good friend that I actually have a lot of respect for is Julie. So I guess for next steps, so for folks who don't know, we finally got permission to start a Twitter and start a Facebook page. Now I'm going to get this name wrong if I don't look it up, but I think it's the Alberta Social Workers had put together a petition for us. And so we've posted it in hopes that folks will, participate and sign said petition. And so that's up there on both our Facebook and our Twitter. And I had a really good win the other day. Do you know, Laura, there's a fellow named Romeo Saganash, and he was an NDP MP, and he didn't rerun in the last election, so but his partner actually did, and she took down my Liberal MP in Winnipeg Centre. So it went from Robert Falcon-Ouellette to Leah Gazin, and Leah Gazin is partners with Romeo Saganash. So it's kind of funny when we all run against each other, because it's like we all have the same common interest, but whatever. That's neither here nor there. Most recently, Leah actually told the story of Romeo in the House of Commons. He always buys himself flowers because in the Indian residential school, he never got any. So that was a really, I read this story, I cried for 2 days. It was such a good story. Anyway, he followed us on our Twitter and retweeted our petition. So that was a huge win for me. Not our petition, but our voices. Yeah, I know. I totally fangirled that moment last night. This happened last night. I was pretty much over the moon. So, but the hope was to get native Twitter to have a look and maybe make a statement or something. But as it turns out, Larry, would you like to tell me what you were telling me on message earlier today?
Oh yeah, I went to the social workers petition, and it has been flagged by Twitter as potentially, I forget the wording. If I can look that up, it said it was the link you are going to access has been identified by Twitter as potentially spammy or unsafe, and this is a petition that the social workers have put out to change the name of Langevin School. So. Yeah, there's barriers all over.
Yeah.
The other thing I was saying was to Michelle earlier was that we've been sitting about 93 to 94% in our own poll on Twitter, and even if you do a plus or minus of 20, around the significance of a Twitter poll, That's still a pretty significant number, and you'd win a heck of a lot of elections with a 73% you know support rate. So that's pretty strong. That's a pretty strong number, and again, it goes back to what Laura and I have been saying. This is low hanging political fruit.
You know, it's bigger than
It's a no
that for
brainer.
me too. It's that idea, like everyone at this table cares a lot about the next generation. And for me, it's such a great example of civics for youth. And, you know, they're trying to lead this conversation for this latest go round since about December. And, you know, I really want them to feel like their voice matters and that they can make a change and speak for not just, you know, the 400 letters of 2 years ago, but for Rory, who is alumni who's had to leave now, and for all the Indigenous families that are like, I can't believe we have the Indian Residential School architect's name still on that school. So, you know, my like this is such an easy win. And anyway, we have a school trustee candidate as a part of our committee, and we're trying to get them to help the rest of the team draft up some kind of motion, because the idea is if the school trustees of today have the motion in their hand in front of them, just to get one to put forward, have another to second it, and see which ones could possibly vote against it. Like, we just need to get this done. And I'm sad that it takes all of this effort and work from so many other people, because we have six people who just can't seem to get this done. And not just them. I'm going to blame the board before them too, because you know this isn't the first time it's been brought to their attention in any capacity. And you know, look at the conversation it sparked as a result of all of this.
Here, here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. It's to me, you know, I think the TRC report shows us that even the little things matter, and that this is a little thing, and it's a gesture, and it's a yes, it really is just a gesture. It's not going to solve problems, um, but you know, as someone from the outside looking in, I think those gestures matter.
Yeah, agreed. And you know, it's the irony. When I was talking to them, I was talking about systemic change. I was talking about, you know, the calls to action that are in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, specifically to education, that need to be implemented. And they do not give a flying care about that. And I like that is probably the most disappointing. You can't even pretend with something simple like a name change. You can't even pretend. You just don't care about Indigenous students. So that was really the nail in the coffin for me of how bad our system is. And that's the irony. I mean, my family survived the most abusive, horrific system, worse than going to a war. And yet, now that we are said we're sorry and we're going to work on systemic change, we actually aren't. We're just going to get another group of trustees interested in absolutely nothing but a position of power to be the barrier and gatekeeper to actually implementing these Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. How is that? How are we here? Larry, would you like to have, do you have any lasting thoughts that you'd like to say? And then we'll
Well,
wrap up.
just as I always say, I mean, it really gets disappointing, and Laura will back me up, and I think even yourself, Michelle, when you go door knocking, and you get to meet the average Calgarian, and the level of disconnect with the school board. Um, you know, I had, and I've shared this story with many people, but I'll share it with your listeners. Um, every day that I went door knocking, at least once, I heard from somebody at the door, well, can you see about me stopping to pay taxes because my kids are done school? I don't want to pay school taxes anymore. And they would chuckle. But when you hear it every day, that's a real sentiment out there of people that just are looking out for number one, right? And these are the people that are electing the people that are in charge. And so they may be they may be more passionate and connected about their MLA, their MP, their premier, their city councilor, their mayor, but they have virtually zero connection to who their school trustees are, what they're about, what matters, what matters to them, and how they might vote on certain issues. They really don't know or care.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. Laura, do you
Yeah,
have
and
any lasting thoughts? Sorry.
yeah, I'll just follow up on that thought as
Yeah,
my lasting thought.
sure.
I think it's grade 7 or grade 8 social studies where you learn about representation by population and basic civics.
Yeah.
And one of the principles that you learn about is that you cannot have representation without taxation, because that's a important connection for people to pay attention. And it was 1994 when the Alberta Ministry of Education took away the ability of school boards to set the mill rate for property taxes, for education property taxes. So in 1994, we lost, local school boards lost control over the property tax rates. And since then, their responsibilities and their even, I think what they care about, their ability to change anything, because they no longer control the financial purse, is gone. So I think, the big question, do we still need school boards? I think that will be definitely on the agenda for the fall civic election. And I'm hoping that this group, this powerful group of people who've come together from diverse backgrounds, just around this one name on the side of a building in Bridgeland, could be part of the impetus for a much broader change across the system that will make the system more responsive to students, to learners, to families, to communities, to all of those BIPOC learners that we need to be aware of and include in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Oh, great points. You know,
Can I touch on that a bit, Michelle?
yeah, of course.
I can't let this go. Um, one of one of the things that I am with Laura in the sense that I hope that this group can be that. But in my experience with Arctics, when we started Arctics, we'd get somebody who would come along and they had one issue about their school, and it was always around school closures. And I would help them because I helped save a school from closure. And then I consulted another group in Marlborough Park that also saved their school from closure. It was the first time it ever been done. We figured out a way. But again, people came, had their one issue, and then it either passed or failed, and every one of them went away.
Mm-hmm.
And Arctics would still be going today if we could have gotten those people that got engaged involved in Arctics to work on systematic change. At the end of Arctics, it was just the small group of us, and as they, one got elected, Laura was away, etc., etc., and then it just became me and a Twitter account, and it just couldn't get people to spend their time to try and press those issues that should be important to folks. They would just push their one issue, that again, down to personal responsibility. This is my kid's school, and I'm going to fight for my kid's school, but I'm not going to fight for your kid's school or somebody else's kid's school. And that's kind of the state of where the electorate and people are, and it's sad, and I wish it were different. Laura and I had some Twitter conversations after the 2013 election about the the practicality of having a school board, and I argued with her because I was still on that. We can do this. We can have a board that can be responsive, and then I watched these 6 people. 3 of them I know very, very, very well, not having any success in bringing that change that we talked about those many years ago. So
Yeah.
I hope this group is different. I really do.
Well, I know some of them. So a lot of them are part of my book club already. and
Yes.
they're already like, let's talk about this, John A. McDonald, and there's another person who's not a part of our committee, but interested in the John A. McDonald School name change, right? So I know, like, there's a lot of potential for good things to happen here. So tonight we have a meeting with the Langevin School group, the committee, and so I'm really curious to see how they feel, because there was a real awakening from some of the youth from the previous month, or the previous 2 weeks ago, to this last go around to now, right? Because they seen how it operates. I'm not going to say dysfunction. We know it's dysfunction, but they see the operation of it, right? So I'm curious to see where that goes. And just, when I ran for, okay, back up. When I was seeing the Lutheran school, I was really hurt by, I don't know what happened in Sylvan Lake, Alberta in the, 80s and early 90s, but I was just raised to believe public school was really important. It's something worth fighting for, even. Same with health, you know. So when the potential loss of the school was happening, I was devastated by people's lack of concern, lack of care. More, well, we'll just move it to a different land site, and I mean that's possible. Don't get me wrong, but it really was heartbreaking to me how there were parents that just outright said, "My kids are going to be here for 3 years, so you got me for 3 years. That's it." And I personally, I was like, this is way bigger than just my kid. This is not just my kid and your kid, but this is the next generation of kids that need to go through the school. It was really heartbreaking to me to see, in my opinion, new immigrant elected officials not care about my school system the way I was born and raised to. So like Larry, where he's like, would have fought for this system then. Today I feel very differently. Today I'm like, let's just burn the system. It's pointless. There's no working within it. What's the point? Which I'm not proud of. I'm not happy about. I believe in trying to work within the system. So, but the other good thing was Larry, when he ran, he had a marketing idea of these little tiny fridge magnets, and they said Larry Leach, Ward 10, school trustee on them, and they were still on the mailboxes when I was door knocking.
Well, and you're not the only one. I every election, somebody in the area sends me a picture that after they were door knocking, hey, look what I found.
Yeah, I know. That's one of my favorite golden nuggets about door knocking Ward 10. But anyway, I'm just gonna give a small plug in for a woman named Leslie Joseph. Leslie, no,
Leslyn.
Leslyn Joseph. She was part of the Black Lives Matter movement this past summer. I signed her papers. I actually got Larry too as well, but he signed the other candidates as well. I'd like to get her name on that ballot. And nice, there it is. There's the magnet I would see. But Leslyn, she wants to get her name on the ballot for school, not school, for ward, and I'm hoping to get her name on there. I hope she if anyone from Ward 10 is listening, you don't know what I'm talking about, reach out to me so that we can get her name on the ballot, because we need some intersectionality, and not by folks who think they can't possibly be racist because they were born in the northwest or northeast, but because they actually have done anti-racism work and they've actually understood some of these concepts that we've been talking about, because we're not serving so many of our demographic here in this area. And yeah, so I don't know, lots more to say. I want to keep talking, but maybe we'll have to have another conversation as this conversation on Langevin continues. And Laura, you and I were talking about your family having that Indian agent roots. Like, right away, I was thinking of a friend that's out in Carleton, and he is French speaking, and he talks about Eastern Métis because Louis Riel was originally from Quebec. So I know he would probably want, like, if he were to hear this conversation, he would have already been on my phone. Like, when do I get to see these diaries? So I know there's a place for us to have a look at that, and I hope to have you on again another time. But for both of you, whether we're talking about 12 CSI initiatives, whether we're talking about Cornerstone initiatives, or the election coming up,
Calgary initiative.
Any initiatives, like you want to talk about your biking initiative, biking to school, like these are things.
Yeah.
Come back to the show anytime to talk about that. And thank you for being on my show today.
I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much, Michelle. Thanks, Larry.
Me too. It was like having the best coffee morning Sunday ever.
Absolutely.
You're welcome to stay. I'm going to do my exit conversation, and if you want to chime in, you're both welcome to at any point in time, because it is an open conversation. But I'll just do my ending here now. I'm proud this podcast has given solutions, including cultural safety training or cultural first aid, in almost all of them, to create a safer space for Indigenous people, people of color, those with disabilities, and LGBTQ2+ to speak. I want to say thank you to heretohelp.bc.ca for what is Indigenous cultural safety and why I should care about it. The authors are Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fritkin, and they gave us those cultural tools that I've said over 100 times in my podcast. So please support their work as part of reconciliation work and settler understanding. I'm lucky enough to just highlight it and repeat it here. Boy, internalized racism and lateral violence is a conversation I'm going to have immediately after this conversation, because of dress that was really triggering for a lot of families of missing and murdered Indigenous women. But if you are a person of color, if you are Indigenous, if you are a marginalized group of people and you don't know what internalized or lateral violence is, I really encourage you to look at racialequitytools.org. What is internalized racism by Donna Bevins. Of course, there's lots of great resources out there. Do and Don't Bystander Intervention by American Friends Service Committee. If you see or experience racism here in Alberta, you're welcome to report it at Act to End Racism, or text at 1587 506 3838. This is a new initiative from the Asian community, so thank you. Indigenous have been talking about our issues, sharing our traumas in reports, commissions, and public hearings, just so it can be regularly disregarded. Ooh, I say this hundreds of times, folks, but because you were both present at that Calgary Board education live stream, like that, it's highlighted again to me in a different way here. No more. Honor our words, honor the treaties. Listen to politicians and in their policies and platforms. If they don't recognize the marginalized with their gender equity plus policies, if they're cutting violence prevention programs and services, Indigenous education, uterus health choices, gay straight alliances, lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities, know your vote to that party, to that politician, directly negatively impacts marginalized people. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report's calls to action, the recommendation on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report, the multiple reports on child welfare reform, violence prevention, and now 231 calls to justice from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. Denying these reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. Our people are experiencing extreme racism in the justice, educational, and health institutions, with multiple reports that say the same thing. Demand change from election platforms and politicians. If they don't understand colonialism, race, oppression, privilege, and sexism, they literally have zero business running. This should be understood by all parties, local politicians, community organizations, clubs, sports clubs. Great article that I said out loud in episode 62 is Truth Before Truth, How Non-Indigenous Canadians Become Allies. Because there's so many resources out there for folks now. There's no excuses. There was maybe prior to, the internet, but if you're experiencing emotional distress and want to, after hearing anything we talked about today and want to talk, call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 855-242-3310. It's open toll-free, 24 hours a day. You can text at hopeforwellness.ca. If related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, call 844-413-6649. It is a toll-free crisis line as well. For non-Indigenous, there are distress center lines in your area. Calgary, we have a functioning 211. You can also try 1-833-456-4566. And if you see or experience racism, report it to Act to End Racism here in Alberta by texting 587-506-3838. If you see or experience racism, report it. Violence is just an everyday reality. Every Indigenous generation has faced it. That's why I started this podcast, to speak freely without interruption, without tone police, without leadership shaming, without gaslighting questions, as many people don't want to hear Indigenous opinion, but sure want to tell us theirs, usually by people who know nothing about Indigenous, know nothing about colonialism, constant surveillance of Indigenous people, our protests, our vigils, and our rights. Typical microaggressions, people dealing with internalized racism, folks who are gatekeepers that survive off the status quo, or people who are really in their trauma still and stop people from doing the work and deplete personal resources. Internal and external racism is an everyday reality for Indigenous people. But I want to say thank you to my ancestors, my granny, my mom, of what strength looks like through your example, my aunts and uncles for keeping me in line. I want to thank my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt, my stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is through her Austrian family and roots, and teaching me to be a proud Calgarian. It is through her I am a second generation proud Calgarian. And just for you both, the reason why I named this Native Calgarian was because it really bothered me when people would say they were Native Calgarian. And I'd be like, oh, what nation are you from? And then they'd be like, oh. No, I was born and raised here. I'm like, mm-hmm. It gives me like an instant, do you understand settler colonialism? So it was a way to own that back. Anyway, I want to say thank you to Darcy for producing and editing the show. On top of being my husband, my childhood friend, father of our child, he supported my journey down the red road and has witnessed decades of racism and sexism. To
Happy birthday, Darcy!
I hope he hears that. To our child, we are blessed to learn from daily. We're honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and stronger person. I hope my daughter and my family will be proud in the future of trying to discuss these present day issues. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to my previous donors for already showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. To those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or your questions. I have a YouTube channel where you can subscribe, and you can go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. I normally end on a really good note, and I will. But before I do, I want to preference this is my cousin. My cousin has just started to bravely tell her story. It's starting to go national about the abuse that she encountered in Yellowknife by the justice system. I've been sharing it. I've been sharing her GoFundMe. So if you're listening and you haven't seen this yet, please go for a look for it. I've been really clear this is my family member. And the whole reason why we have this last piece on my podcast that I've said for the last year is because she came to Calgary and was hiding out in Calgary in the shelter system. And we were driving around Calgary, and I was telling her about my podcast, and I was telling her about this last line that I do. And then she ended it, and I asked her permission to finish this and to always finish my podcast with her line, and she said yes. So I always finish my podcast on a funny note to say, I want to end by saying I give side eye to all those Calgary rabbits because you're lucky I'm not Tradish. And then my beautiful cousin Marina would respond, or you'd be in my dish.